Alright, how's everybody? Welcome back to our ongoing discussion of Descartes. Not that ongoing, I guess we're spending 2 weeks covering Descartes. This will be our last video moment together, so maybe a moment of silence is in order. It's been fun teaching you guys. You as a group have done excellent work. I'm very proud of you. After this week's lecture, all you have is your final, and your study guide will be up very soon, either tonight, which is Tuesday night, or yeah, I'll probably get up tonight. It's basically going to look a lot like the reading questions for Descartes. The final will be exclusively on Descartes, so as long as you, you know, answered your questions and read the lectures and made corrections and then, spent some time thinking about the various arguments, you should actually do quite well. That test will be next week. It'll be available on Monday. I'll let you take it all week till Friday. Let's do it that way. You can start taking it on Monday anytime till Friday. It's gonna be a little different format. I'm gonna give you 4 short answer questions, about a paragraph length response required. So you want to go into that test budgeting about 15 minutes per question, and you have an hour to complete it. It's not designed so time will be a factor, but occasionally it is. So pace yourself well. Yeah, and then as those tests come in, I'll just start calculating grades, and that'll be easy to do. And I'll get those turned in as soon as I can, and that'll be that. All right, hope you enjoyed Philosophy 101, and let's go ahead and cover Descartes' second meditation, and where he proves that he exists, which is kind of exciting. Okay, so at the end of last week's lecture, we left Descartes as he was pondering his evil genius thought experiment. If you remember, the basic idea is that it is possible that the only 2 things which exist are oneself as a disembodied mind and a powerful evil spirit who has the ability to manipulate one's own mind and thoughts. Now, since knowledge requires certainty, according to Descartes, we can only know that the physical world exists if we are certain that the evil genius hypothesis is false. But we lack such certainty. Hence, we don't know that the physical world, including one's own body and brain, actually exists. Okay, so that's not the argument on the screen now. That's just a quick review of the evil genius thought experiment. So Descartes, poor Descartes doesn't know if he has a body or a brain, and he's left wondering, is there anything that he or us or anyone can be certain about? Descartes thinks that there is at least one thing which can be known with certainty, and this leads to his famous I think therefore I am argument. One can know that oneself exists. This is the conclusion of the I think therefore I am argument. Now, the basic insight behind this argument is that one cannot be deceived about anything, including one's own existence, unless one exists already. Now, here's a formal statement of this argument. Premise 1, either I am deceived about my own existence or I am not. Premise 2, if I am not deceived about my own existence, then I exist. So that's pretty clear. So we all think we exist, and if no one's actively deceiving us about that, we're right about it. Hard thing to be wrong about, especially if you're not being deceived. Premise 3, if I am deceived about my own existence, I must exist in order to be deceived. Hence, either way, I exist. Now, quick thought about premise 3 there. If I'm deceived about my own existence, I must exist in order to be deceived. Hence, one cannot really be deceived about their own existence So that premise, of course, is stated a little bit paradoxically, because the antecedent, the if I am deceived about my own existence, that's actually, it turns out to be impossible, but we don't figure that out until the second part of premise 3, where we reflect. We're like, oh, hey, wait a minute. Someone's trying to fool me. There's me. So I must be real. Great. Okay. Now, if you look at the structure of the argument, basically premise 1 tells us we only need to consider 2 possibilities. Either I am deceived or I'm not. Now, if you think about it, there's no real third option. Whenever you say either X or not X, whatever X is, so either the object in front of me is a door or it's not a door. If you think about that, you'll realize that one of those have to be true. Same is the case here. Either I am deceived or I'm not. There's actually no third category. So they're what are called mutually exclusive and exhaustive options we're dealing with here. And premise 2 says, well, if the first option holds, I'm not deceived and I exist. And premise 3 says, if the second option holds, that I am deceived about my own existence, at least for the sake of argument, then I exist. And the conclusion just kind of sums it all up. Well, if all roads or both options lead to my having to exist, then it turns out that I do in fact exist. Okay, this is actually, there's a fancy name for this sort of argument. It's called a disjunctive syllogism, but you don't really need to worry about that. Just a little logic trivia for you. Okay, hence we have a proof of our own existence. Now, moving on to so now in the text, Descartes, okay, so he knows he exists, and notice that by rehearsing the same argument, all of us can prove our own existence. So it's not just a proof that Descartes exists. For me, it's a proof that I exist. For you, it's a proof that you exist. Of course, the argument doesn't tell us anything about anyone else's existence, but hey, at least we can know something with certainty. We exist. I was actually reading a Winnie the Pooh story to my son Jude last night, and there's this scene where Pooh goes to this to Rabbit's house. And Rabbit, of course, lives in a log that kind of leads underground. And he calls down. He says, "Hey, is anybody home?" And then Rabbit says, "No." And then Pooh Bear thinks about it for a while. He's like, "Well, somebody has to be home." And it occurred to me as I was reading the story to him that, the author may have read a little bit of Descartes, because the author is using the same, type of thinking here. Of course, if no one's home, no one could say they're not home. Similarly, if I don't exist, I can't be deceived about my own existence. So every once in a while, you come across arguments with a similar structure. The game Cranium has one. There's like a riddle question, like, what statement can someone never lie about? It turns out to be, I exist. So anyway, more perhaps trivia, but hopefully it's helping you get a grasp of the ins and outs of the argument. Okay, now, so Descartes knows he exists, and by rehearsing the same argument, we can know we exist. But this leads to the next question that Descartes takes up. I know I exist, but what is the I, or what is the human self? And Descartes begins discussing this question by reflecting on his old ideas or opinions on this topic. So he says that he used to think that the human self was a combination of body and soul. And by body, Descartes has in mind anything a corpse can possess, such as hands, a body, face, limbs, etc. All right. I guess throwing in the body isn't too informative, but right. Hands, face, limbs, any body part, that's body. And notice here that a corpse cannot move on its own. And in this passage, Descartes, he's tapping into a very very ancient distinction between soul and body. Um, the oldest concept of soul, zoe, or Greek for life force, um, is this kind of thin, airy substance which animates the body and allows it to move, perceive, and think. Um, so if you think of soul as a kind of like a life force, a kind of energy, like a thin energy, kind of like fire in a way, at least analogous. That's the concept which Descartes is using in this passage. Uh, you'll find that same concept in, for example, in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Um, and actually, if you were to put an Aristotelian text side by side with what Descartes does here, um, Aristotle actually distinguishes between what he calls a nutritive soul, just the ability to eat and grow, um, and then a sense-perceiving soul, and then a rational soul. And Descartes is actually using those same kind of ancient categories. And even though he's using the word soul, it's important to realize um, that he's not talking about an immaterial thing which can survive the death of the body in this passage. When Descartes wants to talk about something like that, he actually uses the term mind. But in this passage, by soul, he has in mind a kind of airy vapor, again, kind of like fire, which inhabits the body and gives it the power to move, eat, perceive the world, and even think. And again, this notion goes way back to the ancient Greeks. Now, um, just to be clear, these are his former opinions of what he was. So don't, get confused on the final and be like, Descartes thinks I'm a combination of body and soul. He doesn't. He doesn't think that at all. Okay, so why doesn't he think that? Well, um, it's important. So he used to think he's a combination of a physical body and a kind of airy or ethereal wind or soul which animates the body. But here's the key. Having considered the evil genius argument and the I think therefore I am argument, he changes his mind. So if you remember, when he ran through the evil genius argument, he convinced himself that he did not know whether or not physical reality, including his own body and brain and any kind of airy substance, existed at all. Hence, he knows he exists, he knows the self exists, his own self, but he actually doesn't know that the body does. So he clearly can't conclude that the self is his body. So he actually doesn't know if he can move around in a physical reality. He doesn't know if he can perceive things in such a reality or truly eat and drink and be nourished. The only thing he knows about his self is that he is a thing that thinks. So since that's the only thing he can know about himself for sure, for certain, he concludes that that is what he essentially is. He's this thing that thinks, which of course we call mind. Now, okay, so what do we call things that think? We call them minds. So Descartes has concluded that what he really is a mind. And what can minds do? They imagine, they will or decide, they doubt, they affirm or believe, they engage in logical reasoning, they have sensations, and they feel. And notice that all of these abilities or types of mental content, such as feelings and thoughts and doubts, they appear to be very different than physical realities, such as bodies and brains. So the human body, including the brain, has a mass or a weight, but one's thoughts, imaginings, willings, etc., they certainly don't appear to have the quality of mass or weight. So when Descartes kind of lays, mental concepts side by side with physical ones, he's trying to get you to see that they certainly look very different. And Descartes thinks, well, they look very different because they are very different. So he thinks that, on the one hand, you have physical things like bodies and brains and giraffes and cars and atoms, and these things have weight and electrical charge and spatial location. And then you have these non-physical things like willings, imaginings, beliefs, doubts, uh, chains of logical reasoning or arguments. And it's hard to think of them. Actually, I'd say at this point in history, no one has succeeded in thinking of them in purely physical terms. Now, of course, it doesn't settle the debate. It doesn't mean that someday we won't be able to figure this. We won't see that they're physical after all. But Descartes is kind of latching on to this idea that our mental realities are very different than our physical realities, at least at first glance, or even a continued prolonged glance. And this gives, some evidence, at least, to the idea that the mental is quite distinct and not the same as the physical, even though they obviously interact quite a bit. Now, Descartes actually thinks that he has proven that he's a non-physical mind, which has the abilities listed above. And one way to kind of reconstruct his reasoning is as follows. So, according to the premise one, according to the evil genius argument, I can't know that my body and brain are real. Because remember, knowledge requires certainty, and it's at least possible that we're being deceived by this immaterial spirit or mind, which is influencing our own immaterial mind. So I can't know that my body and brain are real. But look at premise 2. According to the I think, therefore I am argument, I can know that I am a real thinking thing. Okay, so remember the proof that I exist, or your proof that you exist, is that you think you exist, and that's not the sort of thing you can be deceived about unless you actually exist. Um, so there you are. You know you exist, and you know you exist as a thinking thing, but you don't know that your body exists. Hence, Descartes draws the following conclusion: I am not my body and brain. I am a non-physical mind that thinks. So the basic idea here is that if I were identical to my body, then I myself would have the same properties as my body and brain does. But I have a property. I'm certain that I exist, which my body and brain lack. I'm not certain that they exist. Hence, Descartes actually concludes that these entities are not identical. So, whatever I am, I can't be my brain and body because I have a property. I'm certain I exist, which my brain and body lack. So that's the basic idea there. So Descartes thinks he has a pretty strong argument that he actually is some sort of non-material mind that merely interacts with the body. And there's just so you know, that's only one side of the story. There's plenty of counter arguments to this particular argument here. But I do think it's fair to say that this is the first strong argument for mind-body dualism, the idea that the mind is, in some sense, distinct from the brain and body in the history of philosophy. So, we read some of Plato's arguments for the same conclusion that the soul is kind of non-physical and indestructible, and his arguments actually weren't really that good. But with Descartes, we at least get the beginning of competent and relevant thinking about whether or not the mind is or is not distinct from the body. And again, that's not to say his argument succeeds. If this were a more advanced class, there's actually a lot of very technical objections that can be raised here. So be aware of that. But it is a step forward, huge step forward in the mind-body debate, um, simply pointing out the mind has properties that certainly strongly appear to not be the same type of properties as brain properties. So I don't know if I ever did the thought experiment with you, where actually I think it was way back in like week 1, where you like imagine a purple unicorn or cow or something like that, and then I ask you what color it is, and you're gonna say purple, and then I'm gonna ask you what color all your brain states are, and you're gonna say something like dull gray, which is true. They're dull gray. Um, so in your mind, you have something purple, this thought of a purple cow or something like that. But none of your brain states are purple. So this is really similar to something that to how Descartes would argue. So you have a mental state that has a property, purpleness, which is very different than any of your brain states. So it's at least some evidence that the mental state is not simply a brain state. In this sort of argument, again, it occupies philosophers, especially philosophers of mind, to this day. Okay, now, there's one more argument. It's not really an argument, it's more like an illustration. Yeah, I guess it's kind of an argument, um, which Descartes covers in the second meditation. And here there's a gratuitous Karate Kid reference, wax on, wax off. And this is, of course, the wax argument. So meditation 2 ends with a discussion of a piece of wax. And why would Descartes do that? Well, Descartes realizes that most people trust what their senses tell them far more than they trust abstract pieces of reasoning, such as either the I think therefore I am argument or the evil genius argument. So what Descartes wants to do here is argue that even when we are using ordinary sense perception to learn about the world, the mind, or some sort of reasoning process which goes beyond merely sense perceiving things in the world, is playing a very large role in how we interpret and make sense of that experience. Hence, sense perception is never merely sense perception. It is always sense perception plus some sort of rational interpretation of the incoming sense data. So consider a piece of wax before and after it has been burned. Before, it is hard, it has a honey taste because it's made out of honeycomb. It thuds when it's tapped, it's cold. And when we melt it, all of these qualities disappear. We are left with something which has a different shape, a different taste and smell. What we now have is hot instead of cold, and it doesn't thud when it's thwacked. Yet the mind knows that this is the old piece of wax in a new form and not a totally new entity. So the old wax hasn't been replaced, it's just been transformed. Now, a little reflection shows that the mind interprets the wax in this manner, even though all of the old sense-perceivable properties have been replaced with new ones. Again, just the instead of being hot, it's cold. Cold, it's hot. Honey tasting, probably kind of like a burnt taste and even a burnt smell instead of a pleasant honey smell. When you tap it, it doesn't really make a thud anymore. Different shape, everything you could talk about in terms of this wax, in terms of how it looks, feels, very different than before it was melted. And yet we know that this is the same piece of wax, just in a new form. Descartes' point is that the reader should not be wary or reluctant to rely on arguments which go beyond what the senses appear to teach us. Because even when we're using sense perception in situations where we don't doubt what we perceive, so we're kind of leaving the skeptical context here. Descartes making a point in relation to how we view sense perception when we're not being skeptical. The mind always actively interprets sense data. Um, so right now, for example, I hear a faint voice coming from the other room. It's kind of sounds like my wife's voice. Actually, it sounds a lot like my wife's voice. But, think the possibilities here. It could actually be Natalie in the next room talking, or it could be someone that sounds a lot like Natalie next door talking. And if I run the probabilities on that, I quickly come to the conclusion it's definitely Natalie, or at least highly probable that it's Natalie. Um, and that's kind of like an implicit reasoning process that allows me to interpret that data. Of course, I don't usually take the time to think it out like that, but even when I don't, the mind is interpreting the data in a way which goes beyond the mere what my senses tell me. Because my senses just tell me there's a voice out there. It sounds kind of like using memory, how my wife sounds, but that's not the only possible interpretation. So I actually go through a little bit of implicit reasoning uh, to arrive at that conclusion. Um, so there we have it. So again, if we were to continue on with the meditations, Descartes would try to kind of turn the tide at this point. Okay, so we start off with doubt. I don't know I'm awake. I don't know I'm not being harassed by an evil genius. So I don't really know much about physical reality or anything like that. Oh, but wait a minute. I kind of know I exist. And now I even know what I am. I'm this thinking thing that has all these great abilities. And the rest of the meditations, Descartes tries to regain what he'd lost through those initial doubt inducing arguments. And that's his project. Now, along the way, hopefully, we've learned quite a bit about the sources of knowledge. We've learned, again, the distinction between sense perception, memory, testimony, purely conceptual reasoning, introspection. We've explored whether or not knowledge actually requires certainty. Now, if it does, then Descartes' right. We actually don't know much. But if it doesn't, perhaps we know quite a bit, and that's where most modern philosophers kind of fall, or contemporary philosophers. We learned a lot about the nature of sense perception. We discussed, especially last week, the television analogy. Just as we see the game on TV, we kind of see the TV on our own private kind of mental TV. So we work through that. So even though we started with some pretty outlandish skeptical arguments, hopefully we've learned quite a bit along the way just about the nature of knowledge, the nature of perception, and different sources of knowledge. And of course, the I think therefore I am argument is one of the most famous arguments in all of philosophy. And it is interesting to know that we can actually be more certain of our existence than we can be of about the question: are we physical or non-physical? And it is interesting that we can achieve that knowledge through this kind of abstract argument instead of direct perception of, say, our body using sense perception. So hopefully, yeah. So hopefully you learned quite a bit about knowledge going through this. And hopefully you've enjoyed this class. Again, next week is the last one. And yeah, try to take those tests early in the week if you can. It helps me get grades in quickly, which is good for everybody. And if you can't, oh well. Okay, but next Friday will be the kind of like drop dead date for getting that test done. All right, so take care, guys, and wish you well. And that is it for right now.